Hi, I'm Henry Coleman, and today is January 31st, 2003, and I'm here with Mr. Thomas W. Moore in Bel Air, California, conducting an interview for the Archive of American Television, and this is part 2. Well, Tom, when we left off on the last interview session, we'd been talking about your tenure as president of ABC. We'd like to know how closely you worked with Mr. Leonard Goldenson, who was head of ABC Television.
Leonard was an unusual boss. He was an extremely intellectual combination of intellectual and down-to-earth operator. He was an attorney. He was out of Western Pennsylvania, born there. He had gotten into the motion picture business with Balaban and Katz and Paramount in Chicago. And he had acquired, when the federal government forced the split of Paramount Theaters and Paramount Pictures, he acquired control of the Paramount Pictures. Leonard was a very hands-on boss. His favorite expression was 10 times a day, what's new? He wanted to be aware of everything, good, bad, or indifferent. He had a very driving desire to make ABC dominant in anything that any of us could do. To do that was good. I never had dressing down or any kind of argument with Leonard, though I know sometimes he could see mistakes that I was making. But what he really did to make himself a great executive, and had a lot to do with ABC, is that he surrounded himself with a bunch of young men who were drivingly ambitious themselves, and he removed the fear of making a mistake. He let them make a mistake. Sometimes he would tell me, I think that's a mistake, but I've got to let him go. He was very fiscally responsible. He had a right-hand man that he brought from the theaters with him called Cy Siegel. Cy was his figures man, his numbers man, his counsel. He'd bounce things off of him. And I soon realized that Cy was a key to a very big future at ABC, because the money end of it is what makes broadcasting work. But Leonard Goldenson was an exceptionally good executive in his own style. He was a graduate of Harvard, but he didn't act like a Harvard executive. He acted much more down to earth, and we had a very close relation. Everybody called one another by their first names, and I have the fondest memories about Leonard.
The vision that he might have had for the company was just to be the leader, one of the leaders in television. Is that correct?
He very much wanted to be competitive with the other two networks. He was looked down upon by Sarnoff and by Paley. And in fact, I was standing by once when Mr. Paley suggested that ABC might be the rerun network of the other two. And while I saw Leonard's face drop, I knew that was a challenge that made him so infuriated that they would look at him that way. That was very early on, around late 1950s, that occurred. And they really believed it. And every time we would get low and feel like something was going wrong, somebody would remind us of the opinion that we were going to be the used car lot of this business, and we aren't. So he had a very strong image of it, and in his time achieved it. There was no question that he was building it to acquire great wealth. I'm talking now again about Leonard Goldenson, to acquire great wealth, and his purpose was eleemosynary. He wanted to give a bigger fund to Harvard University than anybody ever had. He ended up, I believe, giving him some $60 or $80 million in one sum for research into cerebral palsy. He had a cerebral palsy child, and that affected his and Isabel's life greatly. And they gave the major part of their estate to the research in cerebral palsy after it was sold to Disney. I mean to Capital City, after it was sold to Capital City.
Let's go back and talk about some of the significant moments that took place during your early career. Talk about the Republican Convention of 1952. I think that was Robert Taft and Dwight Eisenhower.
Yes, it was. I had been in television almost from the very beginning here, as I told you in the last sitting. And when I went to work in television, there were some, I believe, around 3,000 sets in all of Los Angeles. There was a great fear of television, really was the only way I can put it. People that were in public office shunned it at the beginning. They didn't look too well on it for the most part. It was very contrasty, black and white. There was no way to record it and look at what you were doing. You just had people to tell you. It did not play a big picture in politics until that 1952 convention. There was a struggle between Robert Taft and Dwight Eisenhower for the nomination, just to follow Truman, who had declared himself out of a third term. And the result was that Eisenhower, who really didn't want to be on television, came over much better than Robert Taft did. Anytime you would talk to Eisenhower, he had this kind of manner that just played the television perfectly. And he slowly began to realize that this is a big force. And to me, the watershed of recognition of the political power of television was the year 1952. From that day on, congressmen, senators, everybody began to take a look at it. And of course, it reached a culmination in 1959 when the great debates took place between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon.
Did President Eisenhower get comfortable with television eventually?
He did to a degree. He had an excellent press secretary who later went to work for ABC. He was Jim Haggerty. His father had been with the New York Times for years. And Jim Haggerty saw very early television as, oh man, not only he was dealing with the day-to-day news with three networks who were rising like mad in influence. And he had a great deal of influence on Eisenhower. He listened to him. They had the warmest kind of relation. Another man that was strong with, that was a close friend of Dwight Eisenhower's, was Robert Montgomery, who was early into television with some of the best dramas that were on in the early days. And he was a very classy guy, and Eisenhower regarded him as such, liked him very much, and he had a lot of influence on him. And whenever you would want to do something with Eisenhower in the news department, an interview, or you would ask him to do a public service announcement or anything like that, you'd have to go to Jim Haggerty, and Jim would take it up with Robert Montgomery. And I have a number of letters from Robert Montgomery through the years about Eisenhower and what would be involved with his being on television. We made a series later, much later, after Eisenhower was out of office, which was many years later, in mid-1960s, called the Eisenhower Years. And that was arranged by Jim and by Robert Montgomery. Most of it was talked through, and a great deal of it was photographed down at Gettysburg. We had had such fantastic success with a series that was done actually by Screen Gems called the Churchill Years. They were 13 half-hour episodes of Churchill point of view for the war. We made the mistake of following it with, incidentally, the Churchill Years was scored with one of the best soundtracks that you can imagine, and that record is sold very well. But getting back to Eisenhower, we made the mistake of preceding it by the Roosevelt years. And we did not realize when we went into that very, very little movement of FDR was in existence in libraries. Unlike in case of Churchill, we had just a plethora of material, archives, everything in London, everything in vaults, everything cataloged. In the case of Franklin Roosevelt, I think it was probably the last time that the news people made a deal not to photograph him in his paralyzed state. And there was a gentleman's agreement that it wouldn't be done. So we were hard put to get, there were wonderful scenes of Churchill with his victory and his cigar and his walking over ruins and his talking to the RAF. But we had none of that. Whenever Roosevelt would have to move, they would lift them and they would take the cameras off. You try to find some footage of Roosevelt depicting his crippled state from the polio.
That must have been a very interesting time for you because you were meeting a lot of those people.
I was meeting them, and not only was I meeting them, but to have them recognize me. I was a small town kid in a depression-ridden South, and the first president of whom I was aware was Herbert Hoover, and the next one was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and to be in the presence of the President of the United States, to just speak to him, to be able to shake his hand, but then to get in conversations with him and get to know him and get to recognize him, that was always a thrill. But I never lost sight of the fact that it wasn't Tom Moore they were interested in. It was that dadgum television camera. That was the power that was attracting them to me and my like. They wanted to be on the good side of this thing because they didn't know what the heck it was going to end up with.
While you were at ABC in the late 50s, John Doerfer, the chairman of the
Doerfer. That was during the Eisenhower administration.
He suggested a plan for public service programs. What was that proposal?
Well, there was a great deal of press, especially the major city newspapers who didn't have television ownership, about how trashy and how uncultural, for want of another word, that the fair was. The entertainment was considered to be so low and I didn't feel that way, nor did the public. But the do-gooders and the natural enemies of the newspapers really harped on us very badly. There was a great deal of push on the part of Doerfer, who was then the chairman of the FCC, to put on more public affairs programming in prime time. And he went to the Justice Department and said that he would like to let the networks get together to the extent of choosing a night of the week to do a prime time 1 hour public affairs program of some sort, having no control over what we would do, but that would enable the other two networks to have entertainment program, and they would of course beat the heck out of the audience size, and it would not force one network to do more than the other. Well, that fell on the hierarchy of the decision makers pretty hard, and without announcing it to anyone, William Paley held a lunch, a dinner. It was a dinner on the subject of the Doerfer plan. And he told Leonard to bring one person with him, and that he was going to get General Sarnoff, and he actually brought two, because he brought his son and Kentner, who was former president of ABC and was then the president of NBC.
Robert Kintner.
Robert Kintner. You remember him? He was a great guy, great newsman. But anyway, then there was Paley himself and Stanton, Frank Stanton. And the subject of the meeting was, is this a good thing or a bad thing for us? And he said, I don't know whether we have right under this letter and this exemption by the Justice Department, so this is a non-dinner. So we talked and talked and talked and decided that it could be manageable. We were strongly in favor of it, strongly, because that would give us a two-network commercial economy, really, for 2 or more hours a week. The general was, General Sarnoff, that's the only time I was ever in, I've seen him many times, but that's the only time I ever sat down and discussed with him. For the most part, gosh, I think I was a ripe old age of about 40 years old, maybe 38, and these wisdoms of the whole industry there, and I'm trying to have dinner and listen, and I didn't say a hell of a lot, because I was the junior kid president, and I knew anything I said would be discounted.
What was your impression of them, though, of Paley and Sarnoff?
Paley is one of the most impressionable men in our whole industry. He was class through and through. He had a personality. He was good looking. He had the most magnificent wife in the world,
Babe Paley.
Babe Paley. And whenever I saw him, I was proud I was in this industry. I was not that impressed with General Sarnoff. He was a snapping and obviously had a great deal of disdain for ABC. After all, we were the illegitimate son of his, which was in 1944, when they made him get out of the blue and the red network, and ABC was the spinoff. That was the beginning of ABC. So I wasn't that much impressed. But Paley and Frank Stanton was another really great character of our time.
President of CBS.
Yes. And I later got to know Frank very well, and we served together on a number of do-gooder boards, and I think he was a distinguished man. He had real class, too.
Was a decision made that night on public service programming?
Yes, the decision was made to respond, in each of us in our own way, directly to Doerfer, to the fact that we would be willing to enter into such a plan and to live up to it. Now, 3 weeks after that, Eisenhower returned from some trip somewhere, and he picked up the phone and he asked for Doerfer. He wanted him to come in to talk about something. and they told him that Doerfer was out on George Storer's boat, yacht. Well, Eisenhower hit the ceiling. He told him to come back to Washington immediately. He had Jim Haggerty meet Doerfer at the dock, at the airport, and he was so mad that, you see, George Storer owns 7 radio stations and 5 TV stations. And the fact he had just gotten over the Vicuna scandal, which was the fur coat business with his chief of staff. At any rate, that was the total end of Doerfer. The press was very brutal about, go out on a yacht when the crisis of various kinds were going on, and Eisenhower had no part of it. That was the end of the Doerfer plan. Nobody ever brought it up again. So it didn't live very long, but it died of mourning, but it was a pretty good idea.
What was the ABC television reaction to a suggestion for public service programming?
We did more than I thought we should. It was very costly to do that because you couldn't get advertisers to go with it because the audiences were 1/5 to 1/4 what you could get for a good entertainment show. Even a bad entertainment show would rate much better. The early conception of the television audience was I Love Lucy. That was the absolute epitome of what the audience wanted. And that was perceived very early on. And they didn't want to be preached to. They didn't want to use it for that. They were used to radio. And the news programs did fairly well, but nothing like they do today.
I want to ask you about the great debate between Nixon and Kennedy in 1959. How did you handle the production on that?
Well, we were still very young and had very little experience with anything of a live nature. We didn't have good producers. We could produce the 15-minute news. At that time, it was only 15 minutes. And that was about it, except for one thing, and that was Friday night fights. We had a good production team for the Friday night fights. That thing lasted an hour and a half every Friday night. And the producers of it were very good. And they were very good at picking up various things. Well, at any rate, we got this notice that John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon had agreed to 4 debates on the air of the networks. And the networks were to decide, they were to decide where they were going to be in what town. And we were then to draw between the 4 networks to see which 1, 2, 3, or 4 you got. One network was going to get whatever the one was left was drawn again. And we ended up with 2, the second and the third. And second and fourth. And CBS had the first one, and that was done at WBBM station in Chicago. And that was went off very well. The second one, they couldn't get together on being at the same place at the same time. So that was going to be ours. And it was going to be a split screen, and it was going to be a split origination. One was Los Angeles at our own studio out on Townsend Avenue, and the other one was going to be in New York at our studio, the old stable in...
Well, Tom, the location for the different debates between Nixon and Kennedy must have been a very complicated production.
For us, it was, and we were frightened to death. We did get the guy that was the head producer of the fights. I wish I could think of his name.
Roone Arledge?
No.
No, it wasn't. That was before him.
No, that was before him, well before him. And but he was very good at it. A little bitty guy. He died very, very young, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name. But Historically, it could be because we gave him credit on the end of the debates. But the debate, the last debate, the fourth one, we built a house, a duplex, on our studio floor for each of this was, up until then, everybody figured, well, it was fairly even. Who knows who won? Some papers thought this one won, some papers thought the other one. But the fourth one was going to be critical. And so we built this apartment, really. It had no roof or anything, but it was a complete setup. On that morning, John F. Kennedy came to the studio, and for the entire day, he worked out with Salinger, his brother, Robert Kennedy. His wife was there part of the time. They experimented with faces, lighting, makeup, and they worked all day long on that debate. Nixon showed up from a Navy dedication down on the East River 15 minutes before the debate. And I always felt that that was where the President of the United States in 1960 was elected. Because there was no question in my mind that Nixon got trounced in that fourth debate. And that was the analysis of the Newhouse School of Journalism in Syracuse. Many years later, they took those debates and they analyzed every phase of it. And I believe that their report was right. I took that report to Robert Kennedy many years later, and after his brother was killed and before he was killed, and we discussed it at great length. There has never really been a debate of the character that one had or the impact it has. I've seen, I believe, most of the debates of the candidates down through the years, but they really aren't debates. They're not debates in the sense of definition, but they were reporter throwing questions and back and forth. But there's no question John F. Kennedy was far better prepared than was Richard Nixon. And it showed. John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon, not by much, by very, very little, and squeezed in to the presidency in 1960.
We're going to stop and change tapes for just a moment.